For 45 years, the Livingston Awards have recognized exceptional reporters under 35 and identified the next generation of groundbreaking journalists. That legacy continues with William Skipworth of the New Hampshire Bulletin, this year's Livingston Award winner for local reporting. Will won for his investigation into abuse within New Hampshire's state system of care for children and adults with disabilities. Will, congratulations on winning the Livingston Award.
Thank you so much. I'm incredibly honored.
So, Will, I'd love to just share with people how this story came about and how you reported it. Your reporting found that New Hampshire investigated more than 1,400 complaints of abuse and exploitation from 2023 to 2025. And of those complaints, more than 450 were deemed credible by the state. That's a large number. What made you first suspect that these were not isolated tragedies and that there was a sign of systemic failure here that was worthy of an investigation?
I used to be a reporter in Missouri. And in Missouri, in about 2017, there was a really horrific breaking news story about a young man with disabilities in Fulton, Missouri, who tragically died under some really horrific abuse circumstances. And when that happened in Missouri, I thought, I had two questions I couldn't get out of my head. I thought, what has Missouri done to make sure this never happens again? And was Carl DeBrody, who was the name of the man, was he the only one? And so in Missouri, I did some reporting on it. I discovered the state of Missouri had done very little and that Carl wasn't the only one. And I think when I came to New Hampshire, I had that in my mind of, let's see what the disability system here is like. I knew what it was like in Missouri, and I wanted to see if it was the same.
So in New Hampshire, you were coming to a really small newsroom. It had 3 people when you joined, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right.
And so coming to a 3-person newsroom with a big beat like health, and then saying, "Hey, I'd like to jump into an investigation that's gonna require, a lot of FOIAs, working with the state. It's probably gonna be a multi-month long project." How did you, talk your editor into allowing you to pursue this, and how did you pursue it along with the rest of your beat?
Yeah, I can't say enough good things about Dana Warmold. He's the editor in chief at the Bulletin, and he's my editor. He was supportive from the beginning. He was anything I needed to make this happen. He helped me get it. And you alluded to, I did have my daily reporting, so it was a bit of a challenge of balancing. I'm expected to have about 4 stories a week, so balancing those 4 stories a week with this long-term project in the background, it was just kind of a bit of a balancing act.
So how did you know you were finding things that were suggestive of larger systemic abuse? When did you start to know that you were on to something significant?
So a little bit of context: New Hampshire has a really strong disability community. There's a lot of disability advocates, and it prides itself on, the United States used to house people with disabilities in big giant institutions. New Hampshire prides itself on being this first state to close every single state run institution in the state. So I think there was kind of this feeling that everything was great in New Hampshire's system. And so I will say, for the first bit, I wasn't finding much. And I was kind of, okay, maybe things are different here in New Hampshire than in Missouri. But, I decided to keep pushing and just make extra sure. And I think one of the methods I use is I go through court records, because oftentimes some really horrific incidents, they turn into wrongful death lawsuits or personal injury lawsuits. And I think discovering a couple of those really opened my eyes. I discovered the story of a woman her name is Lori Raymond, who was burned under scalding water in a care agency. And one of the methods I reached out to her lawyer, because I had the lawyer's contact information to the court records, and those lawyers happened to represent a bunch of different families within this um, system. And I think that was a really big breaking point for me of like, oh wow, this is a pretty deep. So there's some really serious harm being done in the system.
And You know, you use the word horrific, I would certainly agree. The treatment that you detailed in your reporting, included uh, some physical beatings that couldn't be considered anything other than beatings. Um, y you know, scalding people with water, leaving people to sit by themselves, leaving people untended when there it was documented that someone shouldn't be left alone, and as a result, people died.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And so any system is going to say, well, certainly accidents happen. And this is state funded, state regulated care in a state that prides itself on being very forward leaning in terms of having multi-tiered vendor systems of care. How did you find that that system that New Hampshire had spent really decades building out had these gaps of accountability within it?
Some of the sources I talked to put it really well. Specific the attorneys, they said, if you look at the books, New Hampshire's laws, some really strong protections in place, it feels like. The problem is that none of those laws seem to have any teeth. People are violating these laws kind of wantonly. Like there's it's seen as checking off a box, not as doing anything substantive. And so I think that's a lot of the breakdown of accountability is there are all sorts of, you have to create these care plans, you have to set benchmarks for what you're going to do, you have to do these in-person check-ins, you have to do virtual check-ins. And it seemed to me, based on like months and months of reporting, that when those rules weren't followed, no no serious consequences.
Were things falling apart at similar places with all of these stories, or they were individual, um, abuses?
I would say individual abuses, but like certainly trends. Um, People with certain disabilities. A good example is so people with certain disabilities are often at choking hazards, and so in my reporting, I've seen a lot of choking deaths occur, and there because of that, all these states have very strict rules about this is how many people have to be with a person with disabilities um, while they're eating. They have staffing ratios, and that they exist because these people are at risk of choking. But I found so many times that agencies won't meet those staffing ratios, and so one caregiver will be watching way too many people with disabilities. So, like, imagine one caregiver watching 12 people with choking hazards while they're eating. It's just it's not feasible for that person to be properly watching them, and what often happens is someone chokes to death.
So this was a three-part series, and the series focused on some very specific cases, which I think is what drew readers in and what made the state probably pay attention because these stories were hard to look away from, but they required you to have the participation of people's families. And families where the people under state care were already people who were vulnerable and maybe could not represent their own best interest to you in the reporting. And so, how did you talk family members into opening up the details of this abuse with you?
I do think a lot of these families are angry. They've been wronged in a very serious way. They trusted these caregivers with their children, their loved ones, and that trust was violated in the worst way possible. They were let down in the worst way possible.
Mm.
But then you do have another factor of like I think a lot of it is about, you know, like I said, a tragedy happened to them, and so you have to be really patient. You have to be really compassionate, and you have to give them let them know, let them fully understand what it is, the project you're working on, and just be the word trauma informed gets thrown around a lot, but I think this is a case where you had to be really trauma. I had to be really trauma informed.
And did that mean allowing families to decide along the way to stop participating? And Did you have conversations that were moving along and for one reason or another, it was determined that the family no longer wanted to participate?
Um, Similar, but not that exactly. So I had a family that just decided they didn't want to participate. The son, you might read about Lucas Hool. The family didn't want to be interviewed. It was just too traumatic of an event. Lucas was very traumatized from the abuse he went through, and they just didn't want to talk. So, but they were interested in having their attorney speak with me, and so their attorney spoke on their behalf, and their attorneys provided me with some documentation, walking me through what happened, um, and then eventually they did go into a legal settlement in court that actually barred them from speaking. So that was another thing that happened a bunch. Is a lot of these turn into civil lawsuits against the agencies that hired the abusive caregivers, and those typically when you settle a lawsuit like that, it comes with an NDA or a gag order that prevents them from speaking.
And so let's talk about the documents and the things you were trying to uncover. Can you talk about how long it took to put together um, a paper trail that showed trends, that showed systemic failure, and what were the documents you had to fight hardest for? What were the ones you found where you knew, okay, I think I've got it.
Documents is always a fun part of any investigation, but I think with this one I had to take a really like multi-pronged approach. You just flood it from every side. So there's the typical FOIA, Freedom of Information Act in New Hampshire. The state level law is called the Right to Know law. And I first filled out a pretty wide, all encompassing right to know request for documentation related to how many instances of abuse and neglect there were, how many um, deaths there were in this, how many, that communications between different state officials about this. I was hoping to get a gauge of what state officials knew. So I tried to get their communications. That request, I was very shocked to hear back that they rejected the entire thing. They said, no, this is all rejected. And so I ended up with some help from the Reporters Committee from Press Freedom. They have a really helpful legal hotline that can help reporters walk them through this kind of stuff. And so they really helped me find the sufficient case law and the regulations that said, no, what you're saying isn't true. And so we went back and forth in that a little bit. And then eventually it got to a point where um, I decided I needed to go through some official channels. The state has a right to know ombudsman. So the point of this ombudsman is it's a cheaper, easier, quicker way to settle these disputes than going through court. So you don't have to go to Superior Court. The idea is that you don't need the expertise of a lawyer. You don't need to pay for a lawyer. It's supposed to be quicker. And I filed the complaint with the ombudsman. And I actually had an official hearing with the ombudsman with the Department of Health and Human Services. And one thing I will say about the system is I think the point is it's supposed to be easier and more accessible, but the state sent their lawyers and it was their lawyers versus me arguing. So I felt a little outmatched there. But eventually I did kind of prevail in a lot of ways. I'd say I got about 80% of what I wanted from that records request.
And can you talk a little bit about specifically about something that a piece of paper, a document that you found where you looked at it and you said, "Oh, okay, this is it. This is what I'm trying to get."
Good question. There are a couple, I would say. Um, the mortality report, which kind of detailed how many deaths there were, and it gave a little bit of cause of death for each category or for each death, I would say. And that was to me like, okay, wow, this is a good open picture of what's going on in the system. And then, I said there was a multi-pronged approach. And so the state denied me investigative reports. They said you can't have adult protective services investigations, you can't have state investigations into abuse and neglect, even if we redact those. And that was the biggest thing. I was like, I'm totally open to them being redacted. However, they do give those to the families and to the families' attorneys. the family's attorneys, once I developed some rapport with them, they gave me documents in their specific cases. And that's how we had a lot of you'll read in the story, you'll read the police report of what happened to Lucas Houle. You'll read an adult protective services report of what happened to Stevie Weidlich. And that to me was like, okay, we have it down. We have very documented proof of their claims.
And so we've now here introduced Lucas and Stevie.
Uh-huh.
Can you just for people who are listening, talk a little bit about those cases so that so that there's a meaning behind us saying their names
Of course.
and we're sharing what happened in those cases.
Yeah, of course. So Lucas Houle was a man with developmental disabilities living in a care home in Dunbarton. A video that leaked of him at his home showed his caregivers shoving him to the ground and striking him repeatedly. Stevie Weidlich was a man with young man with developmental disabilities who was living in a care home in Allenstown, New Hampshire, and his caregiver was supposed to be giving him round the clock 24/7 care. He was a live-in caregiver. His job was to live there, care for Stevie, give him his medicine, that sort of thing. Police discovered that he had hired somebody else to do his job for him. So he found some kind of Joe Schmo do his job for him, and he went and lived in Manchester, which is a city 2 towns over, and had him living with someone else that wasn't authorized. The family didn't know. The care agency didn't know. And Stevie one day was found dead in the woods behind the home in the snow.
Even though the state was not cooperating with you as you were trying to recover documents, at some point they had to respond, and your reporting did bring about change. Can you talk about what happened after the series of 3 stories published and how the state responded to you?
My goal in this reporting was to really force a conversation about how New Hampshire cares for its most vulnerable people. And I'm very proud to say I think we did that. I think the second the piece came out, there was a huge conversation in the disability community and the state government of how this happened, how we can fix this. And so I've been floored by the response. A state senator has filed legislation with that hopes to correct some of the problems. He's calling this a first step, and he hopes to come back to this in future sessions. But that legislation has passed both the House and Senate, and my sources tell me it's extremely likely to be enacted into law. Um, a, a federally funded watchdog agency called the Disability Rights Center of New Hampshire, they launched their own investigation. The Governor Kelly Ayotte, she took it very seriously after it published, and she promised, that we would see systemic change and that we'd continue doing investigations. She instructed the state attorney general to look into some of these incidents and to help the Department of Health and Human Services with its oversight protocols. And then there's a state committee that's responsible for overseeing the system. They launched a formal review, and they've been holding a series of meetings over 8 months to question officials, educate the public. So yeah, I've been absolutely floored by the response. It's been the disability community, stood up and said, this is horrifying and we want to see change.
For other people who are trying to think about how to pursue ambitious investigative reporting while they're in a small newsroom, um, as a beat reporter, how was this possible within the New Hampshire Bulletin? How did you make it work? How did your editors make it work? How did you and your small team make it work?
So New Hampshire Bulletin's part of States Newsroom, which is the national network of nonprofit newsrooms. And I think the MO for States Newsroom was, the news industry across the country is shrinking. And so we're going to try to cover things that are getting missed in that process. And so my editor's kind of taken the stance of that means we're going to go more in depth than if we were, a daily, then we're hitting every daily story. We don't see ourselves as a paper of record. And so that certainly helped. But I think even if you do work for a paper of record, you do have the expectation that you should hit every breaking news event that happens. I think a lot of it is patience, of like being willing to say, there were certainly a lot of times where I like wanted to work on this so much. I felt like I had a lot of momentum, but news broke in the state house in New Hampshire, and I had to jump into it, and I had to put it on pause, and that can be kind of frustrating, but it's kind of the name of the game. It's like, you got responsibility to cover everything, and so being able to say, I'm going to slow down a little bit, jump on this. This story will be here when I'm get done with it. That's a really important like mindset to keep yourself in, and while
Mhm.
balancing not letting yourself completely forget about the story. It's kind of a tightrope to walk.
Well, one of the things that we hope when we announce our Livingston Award winners every year is that we extend the reach of your work. So, why don't you tell people where they can find your work, where they can find the New Hampshire Bulletin?
Yeah, absolutely. All our work is posted on NewHampshireBulletin.com. That's spelled out New Hampshire. And you can find me anywhere at Will Skipworth.
Great. Well, Will, congratulations again on being our Livingston Award winner for local reporting this year. Really exceptional work, and we look forward to following all that is to come from you over the years.
Thank you. I'm just incredibly honored. I'm so grateful to the Livingston Awards, the Wallace House for Journalists, the University of Michigan. It's been just incredible honor.